Thank you everybody for joining the webinar. Today we're going to be talking about security challenges in multi-cloud environments. A little bit about myself before we dive right in. My name is Kevin G. I am the Senior Technical Product Marketing Manager here at Red Canary. I've been here for just under 2.5 years now. My primary focus is on our kind of cloud capabilities and integrations and stuff like that. I also help focus on some of our ROI and business value messaging around MDRs. And I do a bit of some of the competitive intel for our sales team. Prior to Red Canary, I spent about 5 years as a technical marketing engineer at a cloud access security broker. So I was kind of a jack of all trades doing a lot of stuff, but a lot of it was a lot of internal enablement, a lot of training, and then a lot of kind of demo management for our SE team and stuff like that around our, demo environments and labs that we spun up. A bit of personal information about me. I am a huge golfer. So if I'm not working, you're probably going to find me on a golf course. Even though I live up in Portland, Oregon, I'm a pretty die-hard golfer, so I'll be out there rain or shine. And I'm trying to get to scratch. I'm currently somewhere in the single-digit handicap range right now, but it's pretty hard. Just a bit of warning. One of my neighbors was having, I think, some sewage issue. And so for the past 2 weeks, we've had a lot of street work being done right outside my window, unfortunately. Right now, it seems like they stopped. So hopefully that stays for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. But just kind of giving everyone a warning in case my mic doesn't filter some of that sound out. All right, before I fully dive into the webinar, just kind of a bit of background information on kind of why we're doing this webinar, why we're talking about multi-cloud and stuff like that. So kind of in the background, a lot of this is all tied to our recent multi-cloud launch that we just announced about a week and a half ago or so. So, through our conversations with our customers and prospects and just kind of looking at the industry trends and how not only are more organizations moving to the cloud, but moving to multiple cloud environments, but cloud security seems to be some of the biggest worries out there whenever you look at a lot of the surveys, and we'll kind of dive into some of that data soon. So as Red Canary, as a trusted, security partner, we felt like we should bring our expertise to the cloud. And so, a year or so ago, we introduced AWS direct integration with all of the CloudTrail logs as kind of a first step. We partnered with Lacework, and then recently we've kind of been ramping up a lot of our cloud expertise and cloud capabilities. So we recently introduced direct Azure integration alongside Microsoft Defender for Cloud to take in those native alerts. GCP native integration is currently in early access. So for any customers that are kind of interested and have GCP, we are able to kind of get you in early on and kind of support that, leading to a go live in the next couple of months. And then same thing, we've been partnering with Wiz and are building out that integration as well. We've also done a series of things around the cloud and stuff like that, basically, constantly improving our threat intel and research capabilities to ensure that whatever data we're giving to you and kind of all of the insights are present there. So you're staying ahead of adversaries and kind of the threat tactics that they're using. And then obviously we're constantly updating our readiness exercises to help your team prepare for the type of threats that may come their way within the cloud. And then from the data plane side, we do have our Linux CDR agent, which constantly gets updated. And we recently added kind of improved metadata collection to kind of help identify the origin points of where threats kind of start with. So as we dive into this webinar, I want to kind of start with a couple of interesting sort of survey data points that I've come across when I've been doing research over the past couple of months. So one, starting off with, the Cloud Security Alliance recently released a brand new State of Security Remediation report last month. So this is pretty new. Just came out sometime in February. And what they found was that of their respondents, they found that only 23% of organizations say that they have full visibility into their cloud. I think that's pretty common, and I would imagine that most of you attending this, cloud webinar are also kind of in that category of like, hey, you're probably within that 77% feeling like maybe you lack some bit of visibility, maybe you are unsure of the type of threats within your cloud and you want to learn how to secure it a little bit more. Oddly enough, whenever I look at these data points across various reports, a lot of the numbers almost kind of match up together. Like no matter how those reports are done, who they survey, what groups or industries, the numbers always seem to match up and align and stay pretty consistent year over year. So here, a Checkpoint 2023 survey found that 76%, which would kind of match that original number by the CSA, that 76% of organizations are extremely concerned about their security environment within the cloud. So again, they are, stressed about lacking visibility and understanding the type of threats, and may feel like they are unprepared. And not necessarily about the security of multi-cloud environments, but just something interesting that I found. According to Thales in 2023, 79% of the respondents claim that they are a multi-cloud environment. And this one kind of came as a shock to me. So in my mind, for the longest time, moving to a cloud security provider or cloud service provider like AWS or GCP, I just always imagined you would just move into one and just utilize all of those services because it is your infrastructure and it would be easier to maintain that all under kind of one umbrella, portal or organization and stuff like that. But, doing research, whether it's due to efficiency purposes, maybe, managing S3 buckets in AWS is easier than anywhere else, but maybe spinning up virtual machines in Azure is easier because you are a Microsoft shop or any sort of combination of reasons. People are turning to multi-cloud environments. And obviously for larger organizations that might acquire other companies, they do have to kind of balance that. If, you might have been an AWS shop and you acquired somebody who was a GCP shop, you're obviously going to have to support both of them until you figure out a, proper cloud strategy to either condense them into one or continue supporting both or more, stuff like that. So difficulties with multi-cloud. Why is multi-cloud so hard to protect? What is it about clouds in general that make it hard to kind of gain that visibility and secure it? So at a very base level, cloud environments are very, very complicated. And each one of these cloud environments are very different from each other. Even if at the foundational level, they all kind of support the same things, right? You have your storage buckets, you have your ability to spin up virtual machines or other cloud instances and resources. This underlying services and processes and how you go about it, maybe the roles that you use, the specific configurations, maybe some of the terminology is different, or maybe there's brand new services in one that isn't quite supported in the other. And being able to balance that amongst supporting multiple is very complicated and hard to do. In general, I don't think that anyone within the industry as a security professional can claim to be a full-on expert within one of these clouds. There are so many different components to them that it's hard to know with confidence and that high level of expertise every single service and role and governance type thing that you have to be worried about, let alone when you expand into multiple. Beyond that, from a base level of security, you need to have full visibility over those environments and observability over them constantly. So two kind of different things here. Visibility means you have to have the awareness of what is being spun up in your environment, what resources are out there, what roles are out there that have been created, what users are out there, admin accounts, and all of that stuff. You have to be aware of all of those at a base level to know what you have to protect. And then you have to have constant observability over those, meaning you need to pay attention to them 24/7, reviewing those logs, reviewing the behavioral activity to identify when something suspicious or malicious might be occurring. Once you have that done, then you need to have, the resources, enough staff, enough time, to be able, and expertise to be able to monitor those and actually detect things, right? Whenever you're reviewing your alerts and stuff, you actually have to have the knowledge to know, is this a real threat, or is this something I can ignore, or is this something that we configured or set up in a certain way because other services are reliant on it? Is that a real risk or vulnerability or not? And then if you do detect a threat, do you have that experience necessary to actually mitigate it and remediate it quickly before it becomes a huge problem or before the breach actually happens. And so when you look at something like AWS, I apologize, some of the screenshots when you upload them into On24 kind of blur this out. This is in the AWS visibility guide that is part of the assets. This is also taken directly from AWS's website, but this is just kind of a breakdown of all of the different kind of services that AWS covers, what categories they kind of fall under, and what they are that you have to pay attention to and that you have to know about and secure, right? These are all the type of configurations, services, processes, role accounts, admin account type things that you have to be aware of and kind of lock down to some degree, because any one of these can be easily exposed to the larger public, creating kind of a risk or vulnerability that somebody can exploit. And again, this is just AWS. These type of services can be completely different within Azure or GCP. So if you're in a multi-cloud environment, that's where you get that multiplied complexity factor, where each of these are kind of different and they don't necessarily align to each other. So we released this AWS visibility guide. I highly recommend you guys download it and check it out within the resources after this webinar. I think it's very helpful to kind of give you a base level foundation of all the things that you need to be aware of. And just know that we are working on basically the same sort of things for Azure, and then we will eventually work on one for GCP down the line as well, because we understand that they are complicated and there are just so many different things that you have to be aware of and to control. Other reasons why cloud environments are kind of complicated is, even though it's one entity, there are kind of two separate things that you have to pay attention to with different type of security tools and different kind of knowledge and expertise. So you have your base control plane, obviously, that's controlling everything, where you could spin up all of your users, spin up all of your cloud instances. Somebody, an adversary gaining access to your control plane means that they have access to your entire infrastructure and can do large amounts of damage. So the level of things that you have to pay attention to in the control plane are huge, but also very different, right? You're more so looking for suspicious activity of somebody spinning up additional resources, somebody making changes to your configuration. But as we expressed with the control plane, there are so many different aspects that you have to pay attention to that a large number of breaches and vulnerabilities often stem from accidents or misconfigurations, or developers trying to work quickly to fix something within production, fix something within your environment without the knowledge or foresight of what ramifications that might have on your security. And then on the other side, you have the data plane, those actual endpoints in the cloud that you might be spinning up, right? All of your EC2 instances, your virtual machines, anything running on a Linux kind of operating system that might be running. And these might be your production environments or something running, a website for your SaaS organization or something like that. Now, while these might be kind of minor in the sense of if somebody gains control of that, they at least are confined to that individual instance, in theory. There are ways for them to kind of escape out to the host, to the control plane. But in general, you're looking at these more as an endpoint, in which case you're kind of treating this like you would any other endpoint or workstation that you have with EDR-based tools and stuff like that. So not only do you have to be an expert in the control plane in AWS or GCP or Azure, you need to be an expert in the virtual machines and Linux and have the knowledge of whatever EDR tools you're installing there as well. So when you think about protecting the cloud, I know there are a slew of other tools, but for the purposes of what we're talking about today and kind of where our focus is, I'm going to kind of cover kind of the main three. So each of these cloud systems have their own built-in native security. That native security, right, you think of AWS Guard Duty, Azure's Defender for Cloud, GCP's Security Command Center. They're kind of looking at both the control plane and the data planes. So it will kind of surface some sort of threat activity within both of those kind of environments, but it doesn't necessarily know what you're trying to do with your environment. It doesn't necessarily know what is actually a risk or a vulnerability, and it's not going to make those determinations on your behalf. So a lot of times these native alerts tend to be very noisy and generate a lot of false positives, which are hard to parse or hard to understand what's coming from them. They also tend to be very limited because AWS isn't necessarily a security company responsible for threat detection and activity monitoring and stuff like that. They just have this built into their system because they're aware of what kind of risks and vulnerabilities there might be inherently in AWS, but they're not actively doing threat research like other security companies would be. And so there's always going to be a limited amount of what they can detect and limited in how you could respond through them, right? There's only so much that you could do for customizing the alerts and notifications and how you remediate or react to a threat that might be identified. The other main way for kind of protecting the control plane, and probably the one that most people on this call will be familiar with, are kind of the CNAPs and CSPMs out there, right? The cloud native application protection platforms or configuration security posture management type things that are out there. So like our partners Wiz and Lacework do. And for the most part, most people will associate that primarily with the CSPM side of things, the configuration management stuff. So they will go ahead and scan your control plane at rest, but they're on a schedule, and they kind of look at, your role permissions, your admin accounts, your S3 bucket configurations and stuff like that to identify where things might be risky or vulnerable, leaving you open to potential exploits and stuff like that. The downside to some of these systems is that they are kind of static scans and they're only on a schedule. Sometimes it's once per day. Some of these systems will allow you to schedule multiple per day, but it's usually only a couple of times because it is scanning your entire system, and that is cost prohibitive with an API to repeatedly scan a system on a daily basis or on an hourly or minute by minute basis. So that means that there could be gaps of if something was scanned and then something was changed right after, there's a gap between when that might happen and when the next scan might pick up something, leaving you vulnerable during those kind of open periods. It also isn't necessarily looking at the context of what those configuration issues are. It's only looking at the state of your environment at that given moment. Meaning if they identify that, hey, this S3 bucket is exposed publicly or exposed to more people than it thinks it should be, it doesn't necessarily know who did it or when or why that happens. It just knows that, hey, this seems to me like a vulnerability, and then it becomes up to you to make that sort of individual investigation to determine, is a threat actually happening, or am I just exposed and I need to shut this down? And then if you shut it down, what does that mean in the larger scheme of your organization? Are other services or applications tied to access to that S3 bucket, and are you going to break something if you make those changes? A CSPM isn't going to know that and will still require a bit of manual labor on the back end. And then for the data plane, as we mentioned, you could almost think of all of those cloud instances as endpoints in the cloud where you are protecting them with various levels of EDR tools that are specifically focused on Linux, where they could look at process and user activity, memory integrity, runtime threat detection, and all of that stuff. Obviously, Red Canary has a Linux EDR, but there are other tools out there, right? CrowdStrike has an EDR tool that supports Linux, SentinelOne, and so forth. They all support them. Now, again, I kind of mentioned there are larger sort of cloud security tools out there. You have your CASBs or SASEs now, Secure Access Service Edge, that might be looking more at some of the contextual access control parts of things, controlling what a user can and can't do in the cloud, and more so centered along data protection. But in this case, we're trying to focus more on some of the more malicious activity versus kind of data leakage protection type of stuff in this case. So another set of stats before we kind of dive into kind of what you could do to think about your own security team and how you're addressing some of these needs, or how do you identify those security gaps. So what I found throughout a lot of my research, and again is kind of a pretty consistent thing that constantly pops up, is that organizations are using a lot of security tools to try to take care of their cloud security and cloud environments, but they also feel like they don't have the necessary knowledge or staff or resources or budget to put to these sorts of things to make sense of what those tools are actually telling them or helping them with. So again, according to the CSA, the recent report, 61% of organizations are using 3 to 6 different detection tools within their cloud environments. That's a lot of stuff. So again, adding more complications. You have to be an expert in AWS or Azure or GCP. You have to be an expert in the data plane stuff. But then you also have to be an expert in 3 to 6 different tools to make sense of what are they looking at, what type of threats are they surfacing, and then how do you actually use those tools to remediate and react to certain things. But as we found, a lot of organizations feel like they don't have enough staff on hand to possibly operationalize those security tools, or leads to those kind of cloud security gaps. So according to the ESG ISSA last year in a 2023 report, 71% of organizations feel they're impacted by the cybersecurity skills shortage. And again, the kind of number pairing here is that in SANS 2023 SOC survey, only 31% of respondents say that they are able to kind of operate and maintain their own internal 24/7 SOC team. And as you see with a lot of cloud security, it does require you to have a 24/7 SOC team monitoring your environments all the time. And most companies are not able to support that internally because, as we've seen, there are more cybersecurity jobs out there than there are cybersecurity professionals. So it's hard to kind of build and maintain your team without them getting poached to another organization since there's not enough people to hire. And what this results in is what IBM found in their cost of a data breach report, and that 33% of the breaches that they studied last year were only identified by the internal team 33% of the time. That means that nearly 70% of the time, breaches are either identified by a third-party security company, so hopefully they did partner with somebody that could help them identify that, or what mostly happens is it's revealed by the malicious actor themselves, by the adversary revealing, hey, we have your data now, and now starts the ransomware exploitation type of thing. So as we dive into what you can do, what I would recommend is using a framework to kind of help you identify your own security gaps and to start thinking about the modern SOC in a different way, to understand that it is very difficult to build and maintain these sorts of internal SOC teams on your own, and that it might be reasonable to start considering partnering with a trusted security partner who can help kind of evolve with your organization and help kind of shore up those security gaps once you've identified them, but then at least be flexible enough to change with you. So when you get to a point where you have more resources and can build out your team or get more education and kind of internal knowledge around cloud security threats, that security provider that you're partnering with can kind of adapt and start focusing in other areas and let you kind of do what you do best. So using something like the NIST Cybersecurity framework, I like to do it where I break it down into kind of 3 main categories, right? The NIST Cybersecurity framework covers identify, protect, detect, respond, and recovery. I like to break those down based on kind of the life cycle of a threat. So you have kind of the preparation phase where everything is pre-threat. It's all of the things that you're responsible for and that you need to be on top of in order to make sure that your team and your organization is prepared if a threat were to ever be identified. Then you have sort of the active threat component piece, which is that continuous monitoring to detect and filter out all the false positives, reviewing the logs, and actually identify a threat and then react to it at the same time. And having that kind of skills gap, that skill expertise and time to do that is a huge part of active threat response. And then hopefully the last part, which is a place that I would hope nobody ever has to be in, is kind of the post-threat breach has already happened type of thing, where you're in the recovery phase. And now it's all about mitigating damage, restoring your data, and rebuilding your systems. When you zoom out with the NIST framework, and this isn't all encompassing, but this is kind of like a high level view of some of the categories that falls under each of these individual kind of NIST framework responsibilities that an org must be paying attention to and aware of, that you really start to see how complicated it is across the board, across security. But each one of these things applies to cloud security individually, as well as endpoint security, application network, and so forth, right? Under the governance part, you have kind of the management of your people, how you manage your staff, train them, educate them, manage burnout and churn, the type of tools that you invest in, what they tie into, and then how do you manage that data and maintain compliance. And then across everything else, like, do you have teams spun up to do the threat research or threat modeling or simulation to practice and prepare your team for a possible threat? Do you have the capability to monitor 24/7 and make sense of the tools? And do you have the experience to remediate and contain a threat if it were to happen in real time? So the best way to kind of do those sorts of assessments is to build out kind of a cyber defense matrix grid. We are not the first people to do this. Shout out to the Cyber Defense Matrix online for the inspiration. Now, this is just a very high level of just using the NIST framework of identify, protect, and so forth at the top, and then your domains on the side. But you could be more granular, right? Going back to this last page, you could split it up by each of these individual things like identity management, access management, threat research, threat analytics, all of that stuff across the top, instead to be more granular, and then really assess rather than just doing a checkbox to say, hey, I invested in this tool or I hired this one person to cover this, we are good, but really be honest and transparent with yourself to give yourself a grade on these. And so you could do it in a couple ways. You could do, a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, like you see up here under IAS, where 1 is weak, 5 is strong, or 5 you're very confident, or 10 you're very confident, whatever ranking system you want to do. Or you could do a more binary, like under the endpoints here, where you could say, hey, we have no coverage here or very little coverage, and it actively hurts us, so that's a negative, versus we're neutral here, we have some coverage, and we might need to revisit it later on. And then a positive one is, hey, we have full coverage here, I don't need to think about this, we are good. But any way that you could fully assess where you are, and then once you've identified those security gaps, then it's a matter of figuring out what must be sourced in-house versus what could be outsourced to a trusted security partner. And so we kind of built this slide as a way to kind of ask those internal questions to yourself. So things that you would need to do in-house, and again, going back to that last slide, you could color code things. It doesn't have to be super binary. Again, within identify and stuff like that, there are probably things that you have to do in-house, like asset management or user and identity management. You might invest in a tool, but you still have to maintain all of that, all of the processes tied to them in-house. But things like threat research and threat intel and threat analytics, you could possibly outsource. So what to do in-house, the kind of unique or uncommon things that only apply to your business. Maybe you have specific intellectual property type things. Maybe there's very sensitive data that you can't risk somebody outside of the company viewing or seeing within the larger context of how you secure your environment, right? Things that are maybe strategically important within your organization or requires a lot of communication across different departments within your org itself, right? Those type of very highly sensitive or highly complex things you could maintain in-house. But then when you start to look at your security gaps and think about what you could possibly outsource or co-manage with a trusted partner, you could think of things as the more common universal threats, right? If you've moved into AWS or Azure or GCP or a combination of all three of those, and you need to build out your threat detection capabilities, you should understand that there are plenty of other organizations that are doing the same sort of things that you must do. So then it's sort of, why do I need to reinvent the wheel? Why should I be starting from scratch when I don't have that security knowledge in the cloud, or I haven't done enough threat research here to know what I'm looking for? I don't have the experience on my team who have reacted to cloud threats in real time and can be able to stop them before it becomes a breach. Those type of things you could consider potentially outsourcing, right? The common things that everyone has to build. And if you trust a third-party security partner enough, like Red Canary, where we're looking at these threats on a day-to-day basis. We're constantly, every single minute, performing threat research and intel, looking at the latest adversarial tactics, the type of techniques that are being used, new sort of threat actors that are out there. But we have 1,000 customers under our wing. So allow yourself to kind of benefit from that herd immunity, where the type of things that we see from other organizations that may or may not be the same size as you, whether in the commercial space all the way to enterprise within the same industry vertical as you or not, we learn from them, and then we take that experience and apply it to every single other customer. So we'll be able to see those cloud threats and react to them in a timely basis, so that when we see it again in someone else's environment, we know immediately how to handle that, and allow you to kind of benefit from that. It also allows you to kind of get your weekends back and your nights back and stuff like that, right? Outsourcing some of those kind of mundane sort of log monitoring, tool monitoring type of things can allow you to get that sort of 24/7 coverage that your internal team might not have the capacity to handle. So as we kind of come to the close, we'll kind of talk more about how Red Canary helps, kind of going through some of the recent launches and stuff like that, to kind of help you fill in those security gaps. So at a base level, Red Canary isn't necessarily like a set of tools. We're not just like a portal or a threat timeline where you're looking at the results of a black box and somehow the threat was taken care of. But we're a variety of team of experts that all are performing their job 24/7 to help support you guys, right? We have the constant intelligence gathering that I mentioned, and the detection engineering to help kind of understand what they're seeing and build out those detectors within our security operations platform. We have a team of detection engineers who are constantly looking at your environments 24/7, and if something pops, they do an investigation and kind of really dive in to help see what is real and what is not. And then we have a team of expert threat hunters that are there to help provide that proactive security guidance and support to help you remediate a threat if anything were to be identified. So from a high level, with cloud challenges and where Red Canary kind of fits in, it's the same sort of thing that we've been talking about throughout the entire day, right? A lot of organizations, as we saw bore out in some of these surveys, feel that, hey, they're impacted by the cybersecurity skill shortage. They don't have enough staff or find it hard to maintain their staff, which oftentimes leads to them lacking cloud expertise or cloud security knowledge, which makes it hard that even if you do move to the cloud and invest in a bunch of security tools, they oftentimes don't know how to operationalize those or make sense of the alerts that are coming in, which, depending on your organization, means you either lack visibility in the clouds that you're already deployed in, or if you're maybe a organization that is planning to move to the cloud, your cloud projects end up stalling because you don't want to move into somewhere that can be controlling the entirety of your infrastructure without the ability to secure it properly. And so again, Red Canary is just there to help augment your SOC team and fit in wherever you identify those gaps. We could provide just the manpower, the people power to fill out your team, or if you just need help with one of these things or more of them, we're there to help you with that. So what does that look like? Kind of from a very high level architecture integration standpoint. Again, we are tying directly into the raw log data from AWS, Azure, and GCP. Again, that's in early access. And we'll perform behavioral analysis on all of that raw log data to kind of identify unique threats on our own, right? We're building out our own kind of threat intelligence and custom threat detectors. We'll also take in the native alerts and information from the third-party tools like Wiz and Lacework, and they kind of work in a kind of symbiotic relationship. So especially when you think of Wiz and Lacework, the type of information that we're getting in from them, they help us kind of confirm what we're seeing, right? We look to see, hey, there's an active threat occurring within your environment or not. And then if we look at Wiz and Lacework CSPM alerts and we see, hey, this thing shows a risk or a vulnerability in this one configuration or setting, that could kind of confirm that something malicious has happened, and we could identify that threat a little bit quicker or a little bit easier with more confidence. Conversely, like I mentioned with Wiz and Lacework, they're just looking at whether something is configured improperly or not. And so we could add context to a lot of those alerts that you're getting inside of Wiz. So if Wiz says, hey, this S3 bucket has been exposed, you could turn to Red Canary and we could say, yes, it is exposed, but no threat activity has been occurring yet. So it's nothing that you need to worry about immediately. And then we could take the time to investigate okay, why is it exposed? Is it tied to other systems or processes? Or is it something that is, accidentally misconfigured and we just need to lock it down, right? Or we could tell you, hey, that was an accident, or no, that is an indication of something malicious happening. And we could add context to what you're seeing inside of the Wiz and Lacework kind of CSPM alerts. And then, as I mentioned multiple times for the data plane stuff, you got your Linux EDR to protect the data plane and kind of secure all of those individual cloud instances as well that you might be spinning up. So just kind of like a recap slide. I don't really need to go over this again. It's all the same sort of things that we've been talking about. But the whole idea is to augment your SOC and fill in the security gaps where you might need help, and to secure the entirety of your cloud, whether you're in a single cloud environment or if you're choosing to do a multi-cloud environment and stuff like that. We could kind of tie into all three of those and help you kind of identify what's happening within those systems itself. And I'm going to leave you with kind of one final quote here. So a lot of our partners and friends put out lots of great content, especially around the cloud. And so Lacework recently released a blog maybe a couple weeks ago on a specific kind of threat profile called Androx Ghost, which focuses on kind of compromising credentials, specifically access keys within AWS. It kind of exploits some of the vulnerabilities around access keys. And in conclusion of their blog, I highly recommend after this webinar, you guys go read that blog. There's a lot of great information in there. In conclusion, they basically stated that, detecting compromised credentials are incredibly difficult, especially within the context of cloud environments, because unlike, specific sort of ransomware or malware type threats on EDR or like endpoint devices, there's no hash, there's no signature, specific artifact that gets left behind that is something that you could easily point to and re-identify in the future. The only way to really stay on top of kind of compromised credentials and malicious activity that spins off of that is through constant threat intelligence, right? But here they say threat intel is not always accurate or timely. And in a normal organization, it's not, right? In your organization of 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 people, they're not constantly looking at new threats or updating their knowledge on something like Androx Ghost repeatedly. They have other responsibilities. And so this is kind of a good indicator from our good friends at Lacework that partnering with a security team or security partner that is constantly doing that threat intel updates and does this sort of activity monitoring manually can help you kind of stay ahead of these type of threats, where certain type of things like exploiting AWS access keys can go under the radar from a security tool itself, because it doesn't necessarily know if that is a user doing that or a malicious actor. So that is it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the webinar and that you learned a lot. What's next? Again, all of those resources are super helpful, especially the AWS visibility guide. There's also a couple cloud-based data sheets, especially specific ones for AWS and Azure, if you want to check that out and learn a little bit more about what we're doing specifically with some of these integrations. Obviously, going to our website is a great resource, or if you feel like you want to see our cloud sort of NDR capabilities in action, go ahead and request a personal demo, and one of our security experts can walk you through that. That is it for me. If there are any questions, I could go ahead and get to them if you guys are sticking around or not. Okay, just giving people a few minutes. I see one question kind of coming in here. Can you go over or provide an example of the types of threats you're looking at in the cloud? Good question. So a lot of this was more just kind of high level and just kind of understanding why multi-cloud environments are complicated, why cloud itself is complicated, and where we fit in. But kind of diving into, especially around the control plane, I kind of want to focus more on the control plane. Again, data plane stuff, you're going to see a lot of the same sort of threats as you would on endpoints and workstations that you would catch with normal EDR tools. So it's very similar. The only real difference there is going to be, lateral movement, if they could move from one virtual machine to another, depending on how you have things set up. Obviously, the biggest threat would be the ability to escape from that virtual machine out to the larger host itself to the control plane, because that's kind of where the money is, right? I did add a couple extra slides in here just in case if I had more time or if I had questions on this. So in general, Red Canary, our goal for all of our customers is to focus on that kind of preparation and active threat part to prevent the actual breach from happening. Recently, when I've talked to a bunch of SEs about other presentations, I've heard the left of boom or right of boom, right? Boom would indicate the instance of a breach happening where you're too late in stopping the threat, and now it's all about that recovery and damage mitigation part. So our goal is to focus on the preparation type of stuff, as well as the active threat when something malicious is occurring, but it hasn't gotten to the breach point yet. So we're looking at stuff like your initial access, recon, lateral movement. So it kind of breaks down to something like this, right? We look at the kind of initial access type of threats out there, things like malicious active attempts, so all revolving around compromised credentials. You could think of that as social engineering, various forms of phishing, brute force attack, MFA exhaustion, stuff like that. Or we look at some of the accidental stuff. So the type of things that CSPMs look at, right? Are things exposed? Are role permissions incorrectly configured? Are there admin accounts that are using base passwords? Stuff like that, right? Those type of risks and vulnerabilities due to misconfigurations or mismanagement, accidental. And then obviously there are combinations where maybe a old admin of your company was using a password account somewhere, and they also use that same password with a whole bunch of other SaaS apps and services out there, and maybe one of those environments got breached and those passwords got exposed on the dark web somewhere, but then that admin never changed their password with your AWS, GCP, or Azure, or maybe they left and that account still exists with that old password and someone was able to guess it, right? There are various forms of all of these things, but we look out for those initial access attempts. And then once a threat actor is inside your environment, we are looking for all the sort of suspicious activity that could indicate a compromised account or could indicate that threat activity is happening. So, the sort of recon discovery type of things where they're trying to run a bunch of queries to learn about the account permission that they have or other accounts or other resources within the environment, where the data is, where all of your, where the gold mines are. They'll probably perform some level of privilege escalation and defense evasion and persistence, meaning can they escalate their privileges to a higher admin role account to give them all of the access that they need, or maybe they spin up a brand new account that performs all of those malicious activities with the right level of permissions. They're going to try to evade detection by doing, kind of subtle things. And then they're going to make sure that they can establish persistent access so that they could constantly log back in if and when they need it. They'll try to do lateral movement, see what other systems are available to them. And then once they've located that sensitive data, establish some sort of external connection in order to start extracting info via an API. But the primary kind of overall threats, right, the main breach type of things that you are worried about within your cloud environment tend to be either some form of data exfiltration and exploitation. We don't necessarily see ransomware that often in the cloud because resources can be spun up and spun down very quickly. And it does take time to try to encrypt the entirety of your S3 bucket or what have you. So a lot of times what we see is kind of subtle exfiltration of your data where they steal it and then try to ransom it back to you or exploit you for that data and stuff like that. Conversely, the other ones that we see popping up a little bit more now is utilizing your cloud resources, right, for crypto mining. So resource jacking, being able to hop into your AWS environment in the control plane, spin up tens of thousands of resources to do some crypto mining at the expense of your organization, stuff like that. Or maybe to use it to, do a DDoS bot attack on somewhere else. But those are kind of the main type of threats that you end up seeing overall within the cloud and how we kind of detect that. Yeah, I think that might have been the only question that came in. I want to just double check the chat since that was the only question I saw within the Q&A. But Yeah, I think that is good. Thank you guys very much. And again, hope you learned a lot. And yeah, have a great day.